Who wants to be a millionaire? I would assume most people. Welcome into Fantasy Football Today, DFS on Thursday, August 26th. Frank Stanfield joined as always by Sia Najad and Mike McClure. Today on the pod, stuff is happening. There was a trade that went down. Starting QBs are being named. We also have MILLY Maker Strategy, which is one of, if not the most popular contest on DraftKings. And of course, FanDuel has their own version of that as well. We'll talk about some of those trends in the MILLY Maker. We'll walk you through some stacking for that specific contest, and then preseason week 3 news and maybe some plays. We'll see how far we get into it. But no chit chat. Let's get right to it. See, you called it on our last pod. Sony Michel has been traded to the Los Angeles Rams. Still just 26 years old. He's having a nice preseason, catching the ball a little bit more, and coming off his most efficient season actually in 2020, where he averaged 5.7 yards per carry. Darrell Henderson dealing with this thumb sprain, should be ready for week 1. But Sia, what do you think now of the LA Rams backfield? What will that split look like between Sony Michel, Darrell Henderson, maybe anyone else that's involved?
It's a great question. And by the way, Bill Belichick, Sean McVay, I'm happy you watched the show. Happy you listened to the show. So thank you for that. But I'll tell you what, I don't know. I think Darrell Henderson is still going to be the lead dog here. But I mean, I can't really definitively say that. I think Sony Michel, I mean, he's just a few years removed from being a coveted rookie running back. So I think he is going to be able to prove himself. I don't know that it's going to happen in the first week or the second week. But honestly, from a DFS standpoint, this really now seems like a backfield to avoid. Unless we get some really good information leading up to week 1 that, let's say, Darrell Henderson is healthy and that Sony Michel is not really fully integrated into the offense yet, which, by the way, could completely happen. But unless we get that sort of definitive information, I don't really see any reason to be on any of these running backs early in the season.
Yeah, and I think a trade like this at this point in preseason, in training camp, tells me that the Rams just do not fully trust Darrell Henderson to remain healthy. He's dealt with a bunch of injuries. I mean, even dating back to his college days. And now he's dealing with this thumb injury. So they bring in someone who's a little bit more proven. He can be used on early downs. Not sure he's going to catch many passes. Could be annoying on the goal line, some kind of vulture. But yes, it is going to be interesting.
Frank, let me just push back a little bit there, because it might not be as much of an indictment on Darrell Henderson as it is on Funk and Jones, because these are 2 rookie running backs, and we know Sean McVay likes to rotate his depth like he did with Cam Akers, Malcolm Brown, and Darrell Henderson last year and the year before when Cam Akers wasn't there, but it was Gurley. So, I mean, I really think it might be kind of the business as usual for Henderson, but maybe they just don't have faith in what the rookies are doing right now in camp.
Yeah, rest in peace to my Xavier Jones and Jake Funk best ball shares. So, well, moment of silence for them. On the Patriots side, we know Damian Harris will play on early downs, presumably, and James White is the pass catcher there and has been one of the better pass catching running backs for the past 5, 6, 7 years. Apparently, Ramondre Stevenson took the second handoffs in practice on Wednesday, and he is having a massive preseason, 25 carries, 193 yards, 4 rushing touchdowns. Mike, we haven't worked you in here. Hello. How you doing, buddy? What do you think happens here with the New England backfield? I know Belichick, I mean, he likes to mix and match. It could be one guy this week, one guy that week. But do you have any type of feel for this Patriots backfield?
I don't have a feel other than I think it's pretty clear it's going to be a committee. We kind of have grown accustomed to that with this team. I will comment and say if I knew exactly what Bill Belichick was going to do, we would all be very, very wealthy, because I don't think anyone knows what he's going to do for the most part ahead of time. So I don't have a strong take on it. A little bit of the take on the Rams side. I think that them going out and getting Sony Michel here in the trade, I know it's just 5th and 6th round draft picks, but draft picks are still draft picks. I do expect them to use him after going out and acquiring him. So lukewarm on Henderson. I think Michel's definitely going to be involved. The only question that remains here is he going to be up to speed with the playbook by week 1?
Yeah, it's definitely a fair question regarding Sony Michel and the Rams. What we did not call correctly on our previous podcast was we thought Drew Lock might be named the starting quarterback for the Denver Broncos, but no, it's Teddy Bridgewater actually named the starting quarterback on Wednesday here. We're recording on Wednesday, by the way, August 25th, but Bridgewater is viewed more as the safe option compared to Drew Lock, more of a gunslinger mentality, I guess you could say. They both have looked pretty good in the preseason to this point. But I think Bridgewater kind of fits what the Broncos want to do. They have a strong defense. They have a pretty good running game, or at least we think, between Javonte Williams and Melvin Gordon. Does this mean stock up for anyone in particular? Because I could see this meaning good things for Jerry Jeudy and maybe not so good things for Courtland Sutton. What do you think, Sia?
I think it's good things for both of them because I think at the end of the day, you're looking at catchable balls. Remember, Mike brought up how much he likes Jerry Jeudy last week, right? But then I just happened to point out his catch rate, which was so poor, but it wasn't poor because of Jerry Jeudy. Jerry Jeudy is so talented, off the line, at the catch, you name it. He can play. And it's just, his true catch rate was 73%. But if you looked at the actual catch rate, it was under 50%. And that's a product of Drew Lock. So even though Drew Lock is quote unquote the gunslinger, there's just going to be more catchable balls especially in the short area targets. So I see what you're saying with Courtland Sutton, but I think they're both going to benefit from this.
Yeah, Mike, do you have a take here with Teddy Bridgewater being named the Broncos starting quarterback?
The only take here is I was clearly wrong. I was pretty confident Locke was going to be the one who's going to be awarded that position. I think that Locke might still have more upside. I think they're taking the safer route. I think they're going to rely on hopefully having a strong defense out there. I think it makes the team kind of mediocre, less range of outcomes, a tighter range of outcomes than having Drew Lock playing. Interesting thing, or if you look at some of the sports betting odds around there, Bridgewater was plus 400 to win this job a few days ago. So it's a pretty massive up in terms of the betting market and Teddy Bridgewater getting awarded the starting job. As Chief is, I haven't seen Chief for 5 days for full transparency. Anybody watching on this? I was traveling. It was the first time he had really gone away like that. So he's very happy to have me back in the home today. But yeah, I think that it's probably good news in week 1 for Jerry Jeudy, probably good news early in the season for those guys. Can't say that I think it's great news overall for the entire outlook of the Broncos season, however.
Yeah, Courtland Sutton, we haven't seen play in the preseason yet. He's coming back off of a torn ACL. Jerry Jeudy has played in the preseason, so he's been, gaining some chemistry here with Teddy Bridgewater. And yeah, Chief is getting pretty close to those AirPods, man. Have you ever had any scares with Chief snagging an AirPod right out of your ear? Because it's pretty close.
We haven't had the AirPod in the ear snag. We've seen the lights and the camera go down once before, but this is new. He's been pretty calm for the last 3 or 4 months, but like I said, apparently he missed me this past weekend.
And I do appreciate that, one of your first statements there was that you got this wrong, right? And I do just want to kind of throw that out there. Yes, I pumped up Sia. He got his call correct with Sony Michel going to the Los Angeles Rams. There's going to be a lot of accountability on this podcast. I do it on the Fantasy Baseball Today podcast, and this isn't going to be some kind of show where we come on and just kind of pump up every single thing that we get right. We are going to make fun of each other for getting things wrong. We are going to talk about what we got wrong and hopefully try and learn from those things. So I just wanted to get that out first and foremost, because it's just something that irks me in the fantasy industry where there are just people, and I get it, you have things that you need to sell, so on and so forth. You have to sell your brand. But there are just some people out there that will only tell you the things that they get right and never tell you the things that they get wrong. And it's just, man, it's really just one of my pet peeves in this industry. The biggest news of August, perhaps, Trevor Lawrence has been named the starting quarterback for the Jacksonville Jaguars. Apparently that was a competition. But yeah, that's Urban Meyer for you. Hopefully, please, no Carlos Hyde 15 touches in week 1. Let's talk about the Millie Maker, some strategy and some trends. And I used a bunch of different resources for this. Some things dating back to 2019, 2018. I read an awesome article that Adam Levitan of Established to Run wrote last year, 2020. Obviously, it was back in October of 2020. So I've basically taken a bunch of different resources, and these were the things that I was able to find. First and foremost, the Millie Maker for week 1. There's 2 different kinds. There's a $5 entry on DraftKings. There is a $100 entry. The $5 entry, you can enter up to 150 lineups. You probably can enter 150 lineups for both of them, if we're being honest. But for the $5 one, we're expecting over 1 million total entries, paying out over $5 million. And Min Cash earns 1.6 times their entry, aka $8 if you min cash in the $5 entry. And then first place obviously gets $1 million and a Tournament of Champions entry. There's also the $100 entry, 28,000 entries overall in that contest. And I know the first few weeks are kind of weird where there's 2 different entry points, $5, $100. But usually, Mike, the Millie Maker is a $20 entry once we get past the first couple of weeks.
Yeah, it's $20 is going to be pretty much the standard there. I think that we could see it change a little bit at times this season. They've done a $25, but historically speaking, it has been that $20 price point where you're looking at someone enters 5 teams, they're going to be maxing out at a $100 price point. I think that's something that they've landed on, that they've wanted to do, but it's not going to shock me at all if we see more $10 ones this year, and just unfortunately a higher percentage of the total purse going to the first place.
Yeah, and there's also a Sunday Million on FanDuel, so we don't want to forget about them. $3 entry for week 1 with nearly 1,400,000 entries. So let's get weird. I mean, you gotta get contrarian a little bit there. Stacking is key. We've talked about stacking a lot here on this podcast already, specifically in GPP and why you need to correlate things. But using trends, stacking is paramount in the Millie Maker. Over 90% of top 10 lineups use stacks, with the most popular combination being 4-man game stacks, followed by 3-man game stacks. So what that means is usually 3 players from one side, you bring it back, or 2 players from one side of a game, and then you bring it back on the other side of the game. But the 3-by-1 game stack was most commonly used in 2020, which is quarterback, 2 pass catchers, and obviously 1 bring back, which I just mentioned. And you basically have to find the highest scoring game on a given week, which, look, it's not the easiest thing to predict because, again, we'd all be millionaires if that was the case. But see him, the most common one, 3-by-1, 3 on one side and 1 bring back, based on last year's results.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I mean, that's you're going to have to do that because what you're trying to do is maximize, obviously, the points in a particular game. If you think it's going to be a shootout and you grab all the guys that are really at the top of that shootout from a fantasy standpoint, you're way ahead of the game. And so you can do that in one of the games, let's say Tennessee and Arizona, which has a 51.5 point total. And then you can go over to another game, let's say Philly and Atlanta, and just grab a couple shares there if you think that's also going to be a shootout. So, you can sort of like stack down the line a little bit and go that route. But yeah, absolutely. You're not going to win a Millie Maker. I mean, I suppose it's possible and it's been done, but you're not going to win a Millie Maker by not connecting your quarterback with 1 or 2 pass catchers and bringing it back. It's just not going to happen.
The most common secondary stack, which is, again, you're stacking another game within that same lineup, is you take a running back, presumably a workhorse running back on a favored team, and you bring that back with an opposing pass catcher. So assuming that team is playing from behind, obviously. So something like Derrick Henry, if he goes off in week 1, and then DeAndre Hopkins on the other side. That's something that could be correlated based on the lines that we have. And obviously there's a huge total in that game. Mike, is this something that you like to use? Is that running back on a team that's favored and bring it back with a pass catcher on the other side?
Yes, very frequently. Really, both of the stack situations that we've been talking about are ones that I tend to use even in cash games, but definitely the secondary stack here with the favored running back, someone on the other side. The only thing I will mention there is when you're doing it on the other side, you're generally going to think about 2 things. Number one, you're going to look at how concentrated are the targets on the other side, especially in situations where they're trailing. So in the example of Henry and Hopkins, while Hopkins is probably not the best example because he's somewhat matchup proof in terms of where the targets are going to be headed his way, you're generally going to, in my opinion, going to be want to target wide receiver number 2 or 3 and not wide receiver 1. General thought process there. If wide receiver 1 gets the volume needed there, unless it's just an ultra competitive shootout, they're probably not trailing. The other team's probably not winning enough to keep pounding the ball to that running back. So the thought process there is wide receiver 1 is having a tougher time, which means they might be looking more to wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3. So that's something that I like to consider when I'm looking for a running back that is favored and kind of playing that game script out.
Yeah, that's definitely some interesting game theory. So maybe something like Derrick Henry with Rondale Moore would make more sense because he's the 3rd or even 4th wide receiver in the pecking order for targets there with the Cardinals. And I also noticed looking at a few of the winning lineups from last year, you can stack an entire game, 3 on one side and 1 bring back, but you could also, obviously you can't use 2 quarterbacks. You can stack wide receivers on opposing sides without the quarterback in that game. So, for example, if you wanted to go DeAndre Hopkins and AJ Brown, but not use either Kyler Murray or Ryan Tannehill. It's possible, but that's a way to give yourself even more exposure if that game goes off, if you want to get 2 games that you think are going to have massive point totals in a given week. For the flex, what I gathered was that over 50% of winning lineups, top 10 lineups, use an RB in their flex, a running back, and over 40% use a wide receiver. And obviously it's slate dependent, but double tight end has not been very profitable in the Millie Maker. And the reason why I preface it with slate dependent, because Mike, I know that you've already mentioned that something you might try in week 1. I don't know if you want to do it in the Millie Maker because Kyle Pitts is probably going to be very expensive, very rostered, but Kyle Pitts and Travis Kelce is something that you could do in week 1.
Yeah, no, it's definitely something you can do. It's important to note there that just the range of outcomes for the tight ends is not really going to equal a star running back or a star wide receiver in most cases. So that's why you see it. It's going to probably in a lot of spots have a higher floor in terms of like points per dollar on the floor because you're getting a big discount typically by taking that second tight end versus what a running back or a star wide receiver salary might be. But you're certainly going to be lacking upside in terms of millionaire maker winning upside when you do that. So it really is important when you're doing something like that to understand what kind of contest you're playing. That's going to be better suited for a single entry or a lower entry or a flatter payout structure, not one that's going to be so top heavy like the millionaire maker.
When we spoke about showdown slates, we mentioned the possibility of leaving money on the table in order to create different lineups, weird lineups potentially, but I'm not sure it's something you want to do in the Millie Maker. According to that article that Adam Levitan of ETR wrote last year, 84% of top 10 lineups used between $49,800 and $50,000 of their salary, which is the max salary, $50,000. So 84% of top 10 lineups from basically 2017 to 2019 used nearly all of their salary. So I found that interesting, Sia, because I've heard people kind of bring up that possibility of leaving money on the table in order to be different.
Yeah, and in other sports, it makes sense. Like for the PGA, for example, it makes sense to maybe leave a few hundred, maybe 500 on the table. But you got to understand in the NFL, there's built-in variance because there's so many players and games to choose from. So you are probably going to be different than most people. I mean, you want to be in a GPP, especially the Millie Maker. You want to definitely kind of zig when other people are zagging and be different. But regardless, there's a lot of players to roster. So you are probably going to be different if you have a $49,800 lineup or a $50,000 lineup. So you don't need to worry about leaving money on the table. What you need to worry about if you're in the Millie Maker is making sure you're not taking all the chalk, because you mentioned yourself how many entries are going to be in those week 1 tournaments. I mean, it's a lot. So you have to make a really hard and fast decision. Which game do I want to play? And if it's the popular game, do I want to play all the chalky guys in that game? Because if I do, man, I'm going to have to get really different elsewhere.
And speaking of chalk, you really cannot have more than one player on your roster over 20% ownership. You can choose your chalk play wisely. And I think based on what I've read, it should be a workhorse running back because obviously more touches, the possibility of getting 5, 6, 7 targets. If you're a Christian McCaffrey or maybe even a Dalvin Cook, someone like that, that upside is just massive. So Mike, does that sound about right? If you're trying to take down one of these bigger GPP tournaments, you really can't have more than one player who's over 20% rostered.
Yeah, I would say you could extend that to 2 potentially, but yeah, you're not going to want to have 4 players with that ownership level. I think that the only other thing I would mention there is if you do want to play more chalk like that, that's going to be a situation where you're going to want to guarantee that you're leaving at least $200 to $300 on the table, because you can kind of capture the same effect by reducing the number of duplicated lineups. So it is fascinating to hear that data. I still personally believe that if you can spend $49.9 instead of $50 exactly, you definitely should try to do that. When doing that extra $100 there, that accounts for about 45% of the lineups that are even entered into the contest. So it just significantly reduces the probability of you having a duplicated lineup, which is, again, going to be better for you in the long run in that. So, but as far as the number of chalk players, I think it's personally closer to 2 that you can have. But again, you need to be more concerned with the building of the unique lineup and the overall ownership of the team. So, because I think that in my opinion, just to say that 20% lineup or 20% player, I think that, I could still put, in theory, 25% owned players in my lineup and have a lower combined ownership than a lineup that only has one, right? So that's just my personal take on it. So
totally. And that just means you need to take a few dart throws at other spots, right? You need to find those diamonds. And again, what Sia mentioned, there's so many players on a given week. So you can, potentially find some players that are sub 5% roster. We'll talk about those in just a little bit, but cumulative ownership is something that we've already talked about a little bit here today, and we've mentioned it in the past. But in that same article from Adam Levitan, he wrote 58% of top 10 lineups were between 100 and 150% cumulative ownership for your lineup. So what that means is after the slate starts, or I guess once it's completed, right? Because we're waiting for the 4 p.m. games as well. Once all the games have started, you can see ownership percentage for all of your players. If you add that up for your entire lineup, say whatever, Kyler Murray's 15%, you have Derrick Henry who's 22%, blah, blah, blah. You want to add up all that ownership, and it should fall somewhere between 100 and 150. It can be less. That means you're going to have a contrarian lineup. It could be more than 150, but obviously the possibility of you differentiating yourself from someone becomes harder if that's the case. So between 100 and 150, does that make sense to you?
Oh, I totally agree. I think that's definitely the sweet spot. And thanks to projections, which for the record aren't always extremely accurate, but thanks to projections, you can have a pretty good idea of how you're going to fall within that range, because it's not like that's a small range. I think Adam probably broke it down 100 to 125, 125 to 150, but you put the numbers together, which is the better thing to do, because the idea is if you're in that kind of big sweet spot, you're probably, in good shape to be, relatively different. So when it comes to projected ownership, that's something you want to look at, and you want to fall within that sweet spot.
Yeah, you really, again, we have to hammer down this point, is that when you're playing in one of these big field contests, you need to be paying attention to projected ownership. And it's something that, Mike, you mentioned we are going to have on Sportsline this upcoming season, correct?
Yes, we will definitely have some form of projected ownership there. And then we will obviously be mentioning it heavily here on this show.
All right, so we already covered chalk. Now let's talk about a few of those dart throws. And again, apparently you need between 1 and 3 players on your roster that are at sub 5% ownership. So we're talking about, I brought up a name, Rondale Moore. I don't know how many people are going to play Rondale Moore in week 1, but he sounds like someone to me who might be rostered less than 5%. So Mike, you kind of mentioned this where you can have 2 or maybe even 3 over 20%, but then you're going to need more of these dart throws that are under 5% ownership.
Yeah, you're going to need more of them there. And where they're typically going to come from is really high scoring game environments overall. You're going to be looking at wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4, a backup tight end in some of those situations. So in situations like that, what's going to happen is you're basically going to punt the tight end position in favor of being able to load up on some of the higher priced running backs, wide receivers. That's tip.
Oh, Mike, we're losing you a
little shot
bit here.
On a backfield situation. You got me?
Yep. We got you back now. You were lagging there for a second. Your face was frozen on a pretty funny pose, but I appreciate it. If you want to wrap up your thought now that you're back.
Right. Yeah. So those are basically going to come from situations where you're reading, we have a timeshare on a running back on a backfield situation. You're essentially everyone's going to play one guy. You just simply play the other guy, knowing they're both going to get touches, things like that.
All right, let's take a quick break. When we return, we are going to mock what game stacks might actually look like. And we'll use week 1 and look at the games with the highest point totals and what those 3x1 stacks might look like and what those secondary stacks might look like. We'll do that next here on Fantasy Football Today DFS. All right, so admittedly, we were originally going to make a Millie Maker lineup on today's pod, but Mike is a lot smarter than me. I'm man enough to admit that. That's perfectly fine. He gave us sound reasoning for why we shouldn't make a Millie Maker lineup this early. I mean, we're still 2.5 weeks away at least. Feel free to explain, Mike. Why shouldn't we make a lineup, and what is this term anchoring that you mentioned to us?
Yeah, so anchoring is a bias that humans suffer from in general. It's basically going to be the propensity to lie or to rely on the first piece of information that you received and really weight that inappropriately when you're making future decisions. And that's really what I find happens when you start building lineups early in the season, early in the week or weeks before week one. We start to think and make opinions about certain players, certain teams, and it just leads to certain biases that I think that are completely unnecessary to fall victim to in daily fantasy. In season long fantasy, it's great to make an early opinion on a player and then go out there and get them in the draft. You're actually incentivized to do that, right? In sports betting, similar idea. You are incentivized to go beat the market on price. So if you are on a particular side, you can forecast which way it's going to go. It's in your best interest to go lock that in or potentially wait in some rare cases, but typically you're locking things in. When you're playing DFS, we want to have as much information as we possibly can and not start to believe things that we think we have seen now, because we have new information coming in all the time. And we're at no disadvantage to make these decisions as late as possible because the pricing simply doesn't change from day to day, right? It's every week there's a new price, but once that information is released, it cannot change.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good point, and it's not really something that I've thought about, but I have definitely fallen victim to that in the past, right? And I think the only reason you might want to be early on something in, I guess, this DFS industry is that, I was the first person to bring up play this player this week, and then, people do their victory laps the next week, so on and so forth. I mean, I don't really care about stuff like that. So if you want to be that person, feel free, but us, I don't think it's really going to matter here on this podcast. So here's what I'm going to do. I am going to pull up once again DraftKings here. So if you're watching on our YouTube channel, that's youtube.com/fantasyfootballtoday. You'll be able to watch along here. And this is something we hope to do all season long, where we're kind of shuffling players in and out and we're bringing up different players and looking at their salaries. And again, we'll just run through a few different games. This doesn't mean that we're going to use these stacks, but kind of give you an example of what this stack would look like. So let's start with the top game, right? The Browns at the Chiefs. Chiefs are favored by 6, and that has a point total of 53, which as of now is the highest point total on the week 1 main slate. So see, kind of walk me through here. What would you want to do if you were kind of creating a stack here? Let's go with a 3-by-1. It could be 3 players on the Browns side. It could be 3 on the Chiefs, whatever you want to do.
So this one is interesting because it's probably going to be a game I'm personally going to avoid, and I'll probably be betting the under as well. Not because I think it's going to be like a 40-point total, but because I think the Browns are going to play a lot of ball control. So with that said, it's not really the best game for me to project a stack. But if I were, and if I thought, go ahead.
Actually, go with whatever game
Okay.
game is easiest for you to mock this 3-by-1 stack.
If we were going to do a 3-by-1 stack, I think I'd probably go to Arizona and Tennessee. Now, we've talked about this game before. I think you can definitely take the discount on Ryan Tannehill if you want. I personally like Kyler Murray here. So I might actually stack Kyler Murray with obviously DeAndre Hopkins. And you brought up Rondale Moore, who's going to give us like major salary relief. Now, to Mike's point, we really have to wait to see what happens 1 or 2 days before this game in terms of AJ Green's health. How much are they talking about Christian Kirk versus Rondale Moore? Because right now it looks like Rondale Moore is going to get quite the target share and the number of snaps week 1 and forward. But we don't know that right now. Like you said, we're 2.5 weeks out. So I think Kyler with DeAndre and Rondale Moore, or maybe DeAndre and Chase Edmonds, because you're getting some salary relief there, and Chase Edmonds catches plenty of passes unless Rondale takes that from him as well. And then you bring it back with probably not Derrick Henry. I think you might want to bring it back with AJ Brown or Julio. I'll take AJ Brown in this case because he's even though both AJ and Julio are both having small issues with their health, I think AJ Brown is going to be the guy. Just a reminder here with the Tennessee Titans, because of offseason moves, there are 244 vacated targets for the Tennessee Titans. Julio comes in. He's going to suck up some of that, but this is probably going to be a pretty condensed target share across the season. It's probably going to go a lot to Julio, a lot to AJ Brown, and maybe some Ferkster and some of these fringe guys. But with all those vacated targets, I really do like, if they're healthy, I like guys like AJ Brown and Julio to shine.
Yeah, and I think as long as they're healthy, both AJ Brown and Julio Jones, they're probably going to combine for over 50% of the target share. So you're right about that being a condensed target share, as long as they're healthy again, because Obviously, A.J. Brown's dealing with the knee. Julio Jones is always dealing with something. Mike, for you, and again, we're not actually playing these stacks. We're just kind of using this as an example of how we would go about it. So, Mike, feel free, choose a game. Show me a 3x1, a 2x1, something that you might do in week 1.
Yeah, if we go back to the first game there, I think that the one you talked about with Kansas City, I think that you probably want to play maybe a contrarian type stack. There would be Mayfield and one of the running backs, and then on the other side, going to be Travis Kelce for sure, Tyreek Hill. But looking at that other game, the one I'm most interested, we actually kind of mentioned it earlier in the show. In the Arizona-Tennessee game, I really like the idea of playing Hopkins and Brown, star wide receiver on both sides without either of the quarterbacks. Just knowing that we're going to get a lot of the targets concentrated in those directions. I think I'd rather take a chance on a cheaper quarterback that I think is going to distribute the ball all the way around and not going to be reliant there. So I think that that's the way I would start. And then we can begin to look at some of the other value plays there. You can play Mayfield where the salary is a little cheaper. Then you can look at one of the running backs if you like Chubb or Kareem Hunt in that spot. It's going to look weird when you put all these names in here because you see the salary remaining dropping rapidly. The issue here, though, we're still going to have a lot of value in week 1, right? We just talked about it. We talked about Rondale Moore. Like Moore is someone, even though I don't have the quarterback, I would double stack him here in this sense, just because he's $3,000. The value is going to be too hard to ignore at that point. So if we assume that he's going to start, then we're going to be looking to a $2,500 or less defense. There will be one that stands out for sure at that point that is like, okay, yeah, I feel comfortable enough here. So feel free to lock in any of those defenses that you would maybe feel okay with at some point. There you go. Perfect. So see, now we're back up to 4,250. All of a sudden we have one more minimum price player or 2 players around that range. We've talked about $3,700 wide receivers quite a bit. I know Callaway was one of them there. Now we're up to 5,100 left for the last running back spot. And then obviously things are going to change throughout the last week and a half or so, but that's kind of the way that I would go about it.
Yeah, I mean, you could just like stack this whole game up, right? Arizona, Tennessee, Chase Edmonds is pretty cheap there. Or even if you wanted to go, again, if you're trying to get contrarian, right? People are going to be on Nick Chubb more than they are going to be on Kareem Hunt. And Kareem Hunt, he has packages where he comes on the field in the red zone and just kind of, Chubb can do everything. And then they'll just out of nowhere, Kareem Hunt's on the field. And if you go with something like that, all of a sudden we can go up to 6,800 for our RB2, or I guess technically that would be your RB1, whatever. Aaron Jones, even though it's a tough matchup, I guess that would be a one-off kind of thing, and he might have higher ownership just because he's a bigger name running back. But this is just an example, right, of using potential stacks to your advantage when it comes to the Millie Maker lineup.
With that lineup that you've got there, Frank, can we pull Aaron Jones back out, take Baker Mayfield, and bring him up to Kyler Murray since we've got the double wide receiver there? And then what does that leave? It leaves us with the exact same 5,100 there. So you can get away from that. And then you still have the stack of the game with Hunt and Travis Kelce on the other side, who are actually most likely going to have a positive correlation. So even though we started this as a Cleveland lineup, now it looks more like an Arizona stack with the bring back of A.J. Brown. And then we're still getting exposure to that side. So that's just one of the things that you can do when you start to build. Even though you had an idea in your mind, we quickly saw that, okay, once we got more in there and we saw we were going to have that much left at the running back spot, it might be a better idea to go ahead and make this an Arizona stack.
Now, would you be okay with the final 2 roster spots in a Millie Maker lineup being uncorrelated, basically just one-offs, or should you find a way to have everything correlated, even if it's 3 different games? Does it make sense to have those final spots correlated as well, or can they just be one-offs?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's obviously you always want to look for a correlation if one exists, but sometimes the best correlation is literally just the points per dollar projection of the individual player. So it really just every week's going to change. Every slate's going to be different. But if there's not an obvious correlation, I don't think there's a massive reason to go out of your way to find one, especially if you're sacrificing what is at this point in this kind of build probably a very strong value play. Because again, we're talking 5,100 here, or in general, almost 8,500 that we have to spend between the two spots. So it's not like we're throwing in absolute minimum salary players here. I think that there's probably going to be very clear and distinct value plays by the time Sunday rolls around each week.
There you go. Tevin Coleman. We got to get a New York Jet in our lineup, right? Nah, we don't have to do that. All right. So look, we covered a few different 3x1 stacks. I did just want to cover very quickly the secondary stack, which we spoke about, which would be a running back in a favored game. And then you bring him back with another player and see it. One that I thought about, and I thought of you once I thought about it, was Raheem Mostert at 5,800 as one of your running backs. And then you bring it back with TJ Hawkinson, who's only 4,900. So, I mean, I believe he's the third highest priced tight end on the slate. And then you could even go with the 49ers defense, although, you probably want to save some money. Mm-hmm. But if the 49ers are playing from ahead, Mostert has a monster game. Lions playing from behind. I don't really trust any of their wide receivers yet. TJ Hawkinson could make some sense.
Yeah, and that's a really good one. As far as the receivers are concerned, we might have, and again, this is to the point of us being 2.5 weeks out, we might have a lot of clarity with respect to the receivers. I mean, Tyrell is shaken off an injury. Quintez Cephas has shined. Like we might get news that it's the Tyrell and Quintez show, for week 1, and they're going to be in a negative game script that entire game, in my opinion. So either of those two, I mean, maybe even a Brashad Perryman, depending on what's happening with him. All those guys are in play. So at least as of right now. So yeah, I think that's a smart one. If we look at Indianapolis and Seattle, I mean, if we want to pay up a little bit, Jonathan Taylor. And then because Seattle's defense isn't really anything great, Jonathan Taylor, now that the Colts are getting healthy. Oh, by the way, I was wrong about something too. Carson Wentz, I didn't think had a shot at playing week 1. Now, I suppose I still might get right if he aggravates an injury, but I'm not rooting for that. But the point is they're getting some health back. I think Jonathan Taylor is a very viable play against Seattle. And you bring that back with, I mean, it's not much of a discount off DK Metcalf, but Tyler Lockett, who's 6,700. It's kind of a big price to pay. Maybe you want to take a shot at a Gerald Everett to really save money at 3,400. I don't know. But I think a Jonathan Taylor as a secondary stack being, correlated with, let's say, a Tyler Lockett, if you have the money to spend, makes a lot of sense. But your stack makes a lot more sense from just a saving standpoint, because Mostert with Hawkinson or Mostert with one of those really kind of low-end receivers from a price standpoint is really going to save you some money.
Yep. All right. So there are some examples of stacks that we might be looking at in these larger field GPPs, specifically for this podcast, the Millie Maker in week 1. Let's wrap up here with some preseason week 3, some news, and maybe some plays if you guys have any leans early on here. But scheduling for this upcoming week in the preseason, there are 4 games on Friday, and this slate is already open on DraftKings and FanDuel. Flat pricing across the board for all players. Once again, there are 7 games on Saturday, including one game that is at 1 p.m. So they're probably going to have a showdown slate for that, I would imagine. It's the Packers at the Bills at 1 p.m. And then there are 5 games on Sunday, which includes 1 at 1 p.m., 2 at 4 p.m., 1 at 6, and then 1 at 8. So yeah, football, NFL just wants football on at all times, and I get it. News to know for Friday's slate. Najee Harris, Ben Roethlisberger, and Mason Rudolph will not play on Friday. Dwayne Haskins will start at quarterback, plus running back Benny Snell will make his preseason debut in that game. The Panthers starters are expected to play almost an entire half on Friday, with the exception of Christian McCaffrey. This is precautionary. I mean, they know how good he is. They don't really need to see him in the preseason. Jeff McClain, who covers the Philadelphia Eagles, tweeted this on Wednesday. Judging by the intensity of today's joint practice, I can't see the Eagles playing Jalen Hurts and many of their starters in Friday's preseason finale. Maybe a few get reps. If so, Hurts will have only played 2 series in the preseason. On the other side, Jets coach Robert Saleh said he would like to play the starters on Friday, but it wouldn't be more than one half. They're also likely to be without rookies Elijah Moore, which he walked back Moore's comments and he's like, nah, he's probably not going to play. And their rookie offensive guard, Elijah Vera Tucker. Lions will not play any starters on Friday. On the other side, Frank Reich confirmed that Jacob Eason will start. Most of the other Colts starters will not play in this game. Vikings coach Mike Zimmer said some starters will play on Friday, similar to week 2. And if you're just looking back at what they did in week 2, Kirk Cousins played 15 of 54 total snaps in that game. Adam Thielen, it's also been announced he will not play on Friday. And the Chiefs starters, last but not least, they will play the entire first half. So could have some fun fireworks there from Mahomes and, of course, his pass catchers. See, I don't know if you plan on playing this slate or if you've looked into anything. Do you have any plays based on the news that I just gave you? Anyone that you're leaning towards that you like in these games? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think playing some Chiefs and some Panthers makes sense, especially if, correct me if I'm wrong, but those teams are going to, for the most part, are going to play their starters for an entire first half. So
Yep.
I like those games quite a bit. I mean, if the Chiefs are rolling out their guys for a half, I think there's definitely some value there, whether it's Mahomes or Tyreek, Kelsey, some of those receivers like McCole, Byron Pringle, Demarcus Robinson. I think they're all in play. And the Panthers, I mean, Darnold, Robbie Anderson coming off his freshly minted contract, DJ Moore, Terrace Marshall. I feel like there's some upside there to play.
Yeah, and if McCaffrey is not playing, which they're not expecting right now, Chuba Hubbard, not that he hasn't been great in the preseason, but if they give him McCaffrey's role in this game on Friday, then obviously he could see some targets and obviously a good amount of work on early downs as well. Mike, anything for you? Week 3 preseason?
No real thoughts. I mean, obviously, fire away with anyone that you think is going to play, more than a full quarter. I think that's obviously a great situation there. I think the only one, I don't even know what day the game is. The Bears game. Which day is that?
That's on Saturday at 7 p.m.
Saturday. So Fields, I think he's playing the first half. Potentially, I think that's a great spot for him to go out and try and make one last case. But that's just my opinion there. I think that if I was playing Saturday, I'd be using him for sure, especially if you get it in any sort of a showdown slate. Sometimes they're offering showdown slates for these games. I would definitely be throwing him in there with probably any of the other quarterbacks playing on the other side.
Yeah, I assume he'll be pretty popular, but again, you can roster anyone in these preseason slates because again, it is flat pricing. Justin Fields has been running a ton in the preseason as well, so definitely helps out with his fantasy output. For me on Friday, a few names I just wanted to bring up. Anthony McFarland has gotten some run with the Steelers. They already announced Najee Harris will not play. Jerick McKinnon has caught quite a few passes here, and I assume he might not play that much in the first half, but in the second half against some backups, I think he could be sneaky. Corey Davis, we talked about his target share in the preseason. Mecole Hardman, I think that they want to get him involved with the ones again. And then just names I wanted to mention, 2 random wide receivers. I really don't know much about these guys, but they each have 10 targets in the preseason. That includes the Lions, Tom Kennedy, and the Colts, Desmond Patton. All right. So that'll do it. For Mike and Sia, I am Frank. Thank you all for listening and watching Fantasy Football Today. DFS will be back again on Tuesday with bankroll management, tracking ROI, and week 3 reactions. We'll see you then.